August 1943. 18,000 feet over the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Richard Bong watches his wingman's P-38 Lightning spiral into the Pacific. Shot down. 3 Japanese Zeros had ambushed them from above. Now Bong is alone, and the lead Zero is on his tail. Closing fast. He does what he was trained to do. Hard right bank, full throttle. Try to outclimb the threat. The Zero turns tighter. Always turns tighter. The Japanese pilot slides into firing position. Bong has maybe 4 seconds before 20mm cannon shells tear through his aircraft. What he does next wasn't in any training manual. Bong rolls his P-38 completely inverted, upside down, and yanks the stick forward. Instead of climbing away from the threat, his aircraft dives toward the ocean. But because he's upside down, he pulls away in a direction the Zero pilot never anticipated. Blood rushes to his head. His vision goes red. For 2 critical seconds, he's flying blind, can barely read his instruments. When he rolls level again at 12,000 feet, the Zero is above him, overshooting, completely out of position. Bong just survived, and he stumbled onto a tactic that would reshape air combat across the Pacific. This maneuver violated every principle taught at flight school. Instructors specifically warned against it. Negative G flight meant engine failure, structural damage, pilot incapacitation. The official position was clear. Don't do this. Yet in actual combat, when a Zero pilot had you in his sights, those warnings mattered less than immediate survival. Between 1942 and 1944, a small group of fighter pilots discovered something extraordinary. The human body could withstand physiological stresses aviation medicine considered impossible. Their aircraft could handle maneuvers engineers insisted would cause structural failure. And most importantly, sometimes, survival required flying directly toward the threat, upside down. This is the story of how American fighter pilots learned to fly inverted, how they defied their training, defied medical science, and defied physics, how they turned their blood into a weapon against the most feared fighter in the Pacific, and how a desperate, brutal innovation, born from unforgiving necessity, became standard fighter tactics that pilots still use today. Every word is documented. Every detail is true. Let's dive in. To understand why pilots started flying upside down, you need to understand the problem they faced. The Mitsubishi A6M0. By the time America entered World War II in December 1941, Japanese pilots had been flying the Zero in combat for over a year. They'd accumulated thousands of combat hours perfecting their tactics over China. And American pilots were dying because they didn't understand what they were up against. The Zero's performance characteristics created a deadly problem. At speeds below 300 miles per hour, the Zero could outturn virtually any fighter in the sky. Its turning radius was roughly 400 feet tighter than a P-38 Lightning, nearly 500 feet tighter than an F-4F Wildcat. In a traditional turning dogfight, the kind emphasized in American training programs, the Zero pilot could simply circle inside his opponent's turn and achieve a firing solution within seconds. Early engagement reports from the Philippines and Java told a grim story. American pilots would attempt boom and zoom tactics, dive on Zeros from altitude, fire, then climb away. But if the initial attack failed to destroy the target, the Zero pilot would simply enter a tight horizontal turn. When the American pilot tried to follow, he found himself on the outside of the circle, bleeding energy, becoming the target instead of the hunter. By mid-1942, kill ratios in some sectors, favored Japanese pilots 3-1. Squadron commanders were filing reports that essentially admitted the same thing. We cannot win turning fights against this aircraft. Pilots were told to use their aircraft's strengths, avoid turning engagements, maintain energy advantage. Sensible advice. But combat rarely unfolded according to plan. What made this crisis worse was the skill level of Japanese naval aviators in 1942 and early 1943. Many had been flying combat missions since the late 1930s. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, formation tactics at an expert level. They knew exactly how to force American pilots into situations where the Zero's turning ability became decisive. A common Japanese tactic: 1-0 acts as bait, flying straight and level, appearing vulnerable. When an American pilot commits to the attack, 2 more Zeros drop from above or slide in from the flanks. Suddenly, the American fighter is defensive. And defensive means entering a turning fight, which means the Zero's advantages become overwhelming. American pilots were essentially asked to defeat an opponent who owned the most important advantage in dogfighting, while flying aircraft optimized for survivability rather than maneuverability. The armor plate behind the pilot seat, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the heavier armament. These features kept pilots alive when hit, but they also added hundreds of pounds. Pounds that increased wing loading. Pounds that expanded turning radius. American pilots were dying, and conventional tactics weren't working. Something had to change. The maneuver that would eventually save countless American lives wasn't derived from aeronautical engineering textbooks. It wasn't developed by tactical doctrine committees. It emerged from raw desperation and accidental discovery. The split S, as it came to be called, involved rolling inverted and pulling through into a diving turn. Let me explain what happens to the human body during this maneuver. Because understanding the physics is crucial to understanding why this seemed impossible. In normal flight, pilots experience positive G-forces. Blood is pushed toward their feet. Vision narrows. At around 5 to 6 Gs, many pilots experience grayout or blackout. But when a pilot rolls upside down and pulls the stick forward, he experiences negative Gs. Blood rushes to the head. The effect is called redout, because the visual field literally turns red. Blood vessels in the eyes engorge with blood. Aviation medicine in 1942 suggested humans could barely tolerate negative G-forces. Studies indicated that even -2 Gs caused severe discomfort, disorientation, and potential retinal damage. Official guidance recommended avoiding negative G flight entirely. But these studies were conducted in controlled environments, with test pilots who weren't being shot at. Combat created different mathematics. A pilot experiencing 2 seconds of redout vision, but escaping a Zero's gun solution, survived. A pilot who maintained perfect positive G flight, but stayed in the Zero's crosshairs, died. The choice wasn't comfortable versus uncomfortable. It was temporary blindness versus permanent death. The physics behind why the inverted dive worked involved energy management and opponent prediction. When a Zero pilot achieved a tail position, he anticipated the target would either try to outturn him, impossible, or attempt to climb away, which bled the American aircraft's energy and made it an easier target. The inverted dive did neither. It converted altitude into speed in a vector the Zero pilot didn't expect. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot attempted to follow through the maneuver, his aircraft faced structural limitations. The Zero was stressed for positive G loads up to about 7 Gs. but its lighter construction made negative G flight particularly dangerous. Pulling negative Gs in a zero risked structural failure or engine problems. Pilots reported that the redout effect lasted only a few seconds during a properly executed split S. Vision returned as the aircraft transitioned back to positive G flight during the pullout. The discomfort was intense. Headaches, facial petechiae, bloodshot eyes, but survivable. Several pilots noted in debriefings, quote voice, "I'd rather endure a splitting headache back at base than a proper burial at sea." The informal risk assessment was simple. Negative G maneuvers hurt, but Japanese cannons hurt worse. Narrative storytelling, showing the breakthrough moment. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron was the first pilot documented to have used the inverted dive tactic deliberately, rather than instinctively. April 11, 1943, flying P-38 Lightnings out of Port Moresby, New Guinea. Lynch led a four-plane patrol over the Huon Gulf when his formation encountered 8 Zeros at 20,000 feet. Instead of engaging in a traditional horizontal fight, Lynch immediately rolled inverted when the lead Zero closed on him. He pulled through into a steep dive, accelerated to over 400 miles per hour, then rolled level at 8,000 feet. The Zero pilot attempting to follow pulled out at 12,000 feet, either unwilling or unable to match Lynch's dive angle and speed. Lynch didn't just survive the encounter, he reversed the situation. After leveling out, he had both altitude separation and superior speed. He used that energy advantage to climb back up, this time approaching the now disorganized Japanese formation from below. The Zeros had lost their cohesion, chasing after what they thought were fleeing American fighters. Lynch shot down 2 Zeros in the ensuing engagement. His wingmen, following his example through the inverted dive, survived without losses. The after-action report noted the tactic, but didn't emphasize it. Official doctrine still discouraged negative G maneuvers. What made Lynch's action significant was intentionality. Other pilots had rolled inverted under duress, survived, and chalked it up to luck. Lynch recognized it as a repeatable technique. Within a week, he was teaching the maneuver to other pilots in his squadron during informal briefings. The instruction was simple. Pause quote voice as if teaching, "If a Zero gets on your tail in a position where you can't shake him conventionally, roll inverted. Pull through. Dive hard, and use the speed to separate. Don't try to outturn him horizontally. Use the vertical dimension. The Zero owns the horizontal circle, but American fighters own the vertical dive." By June 1943, the tactic had spread to other P-38 units operating out of Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots shared the technique during ready room discussions and inter-squadron debriefings. It remained largely unofficial, not prohibited, but not endorsed in formal tactical directives either. The physiological cost of negative G flight was something no training manual adequately prepared pilots for. During a typical split S maneuver, pulling -2 to -3 Gs, blood pressure in the head increased dramatically. Pilots reported an immediate sensation of intense pressure behind the eyes, followed by the redout effect, where their entire visual field turned crimson. The pressure came from blood vessels in the retina and conjunctiva engorging with blood, forced upward by the negative acceleration. For those 2 to 3 seconds, a pilot was effectively flying blind, relying on kinesthetic sense and instrument memory to maintain aircraft control. Flight surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in late 1943, documented the physical aftermath of these maneuvers. He examined dozens of pilots who regularly employed inverted dive tactics. Nearly all showed petechial hemorrhaging, tiny broken blood vessels creating red spots across their faces, particularly around the eyes and forehead. Some experienced subconjunctival hemorrhages that left their eyes blood red for days. Severe headaches were universal. A few pilots reported temporary vision problems, blurred sight, difficulty focusing that lasted several hours after landing. Moorhead's unofficial conclusion, never published in medical journals, was that the maneuvers caused measurable physical damage, but nothing permanently debilitating. The greater risk was the moment of blindness itself. During those few seconds of red out, a pilot couldn't see his altimeter, couldn't see his airspeed indicator, couldn't see his attitude instruments. He certainly couldn't see the enemy aircraft, or the ground rushing up. The maneuver required absolute commitment. A pilot had to establish the dive angle, pull the negative Gs, then hold that control input until his vision cleared, trusting that he judged his altitude correctly before rolling inverted. Several fatal accidents in training occurred when pilots initiated the maneuver too low or held the dive too long. There was no margin for error at 5,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, a pilot had time to correct. The mathematical calculation became part of survival. Never go inverted below 8,000 feet unless death was otherwise certain. Experienced pilots developed techniques to minimize the red-out duration. Some learned to tense their neck and facial muscles, attempting to restrict blood flow to the head. Others discovered that if they rolled inverted but pulled less aggressively on the stick, trading maximum maneuver performance for slightly better vision, they could maintain partial sight throughout the maneuver. This became a judgment call. Maximum negative G input generated the fastest separation from a pursuing zero, but caused complete visual blackout. Moderate negative G input allowed the pilot to keep some visual reference, but reduced the effectiveness of the escape. In practice, most chose maximum separation. Better to be blind for 3 seconds and alive than semi-aware and shot down. The inverted dive tactic moved through the Pacific Theater like an underground transmission, spreading from squadron to squadron without ever appearing in official tactical publications. By September 1943, P-38 units across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were routinely teaching the maneuver to replacement pilots during their first week in country. The instruction happened informally, veteran pilots taking new arrivals aside after evening mess, describing what worked and what got people killed. Squadron commanders knew it was happening. Some actively encouraged it. Others pretended not to notice, maintaining plausible deniability in case 5th Air Force Headquarters asked uncomfortable questions about unauthorized training. The concern was partly liability. If a pilot was killed attempting the maneuver, questions would arise about who authorized teaching a tactic that contradicted established training. So it spread through word of mouth. Experienced pilots showing newer arrivals how to execute it, without documenting the instruction. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts out of Port Moresby, incorporated the split S into his unit's tactical doctrine in October 1943. The P-47 was even heavier than the P-38, making it hopelessly outmatched in turning combat against Zeros. But the Thunderbolt could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and its radial engine handled negative G flight reasonably well. Kirby's approach was pragmatic. If you try to turn with a zero, you'll die. If you use the P-47's weight and power to dictate vertical engagements, diving attacks followed by inverted escapes when necessary, you'll survive and win. Kirby personally shot down 6 Japanese aircraft on October 11, 1943, using these tactics. He received the Medal of Honor for that mission. Marine Corps F-4U Corsair squadrons adopted similar techniques in early 1944. The Corsair had performance advantages over the Zero in most parameters except turning radius. Marine pilots operating from island bases like Munda and Vela La Vela found that the inverted dive worked even better in the Corsair than in twin-engine fighters. The F-4U's powerful Pratt & Whitney R280 engine maintained thrust through negative G maneuvers, and the aircraft's structural strength meant pilots could pull out of dives at higher speeds without worrying about wing failure. Major Robert Gaylor, teaching tactics to VMF 214, the famous Black Sheet Squadron, demonstrated the maneuver repeatedly, emphasizing that it was a defensive escape tactic, not an offensive weapon. By mid-1944, the technique had reached Navy carrier squadrons operating in the Central Pacific. Fighter pilots flying from carriers like USS Essex and USS Lexington received briefings that now included inverted maneuvers as accepted tactics. The official terminology varied. Some called it a split S. Others referred to it as a negative G break. Some simply described it as rolling out downward. The language didn't matter. The execution was consistent. When conventional defensive maneuvers failed, invert and dive, Japanese pilots eventually recognized the American inverted dive tactic and attempted to develop countermeasures. By late 1943, combat reports from returning Zero pilots mentioned American fighters rolling inverted and diving away at high speed. Initial Japanese assessments viewed this as a purely defensive maneuver, evidence that American pilots feared close combat and were fleeing rather than fighting. This interpretation was strategically dangerous for Japanese airmen because it reinforced their existing tactical doctrine while missing the actual threat. The inverted dive wasn't retreat. It was a reset that allowed American pilots to choose when and how to re-engage on favorable terms. Some Japanese pilots tried following American fighters through inverted dives. The results were often fatal. The Zero's lightweight construction, which gave it superior turning performance, became a liability in high-speed vertical maneuvers. The aircraft's airframe was stressed to positive G limits, but had reduced safety margins in negative G flight. Several Zero pilots who attempted to follow P-38s through aggressive inverted dives experienced control surface flutter or structural failure. Others found that their Nakajima Sake engines experienced fuel delivery problems during inverted flight, causing power loss at the worst possible moment, mid-dive, while trying to keep an enemy aircraft in sight. A documented incident from December 1944 over Leyte Gulf illustrated the tactic's lethality when Zero pilots attempted to counter it. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, flying a P-38, was engaged by 4 Zeros at 18,000 feet. When the lead Zero achieved a firing position, McGuire rolled inverted and dove. The Japanese pilot followed, attempting to keep McGuire in his gunsight. Two things happened simultaneously. McGuire's P-38 accelerated past 450 miles per hour in the dive, while maintaining structural integrity, and the pursuing Zero began experiencing severe vibration around 380 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot was forced to pull out early, or risk airframe failure. McGuire leveled at 6,000 feet, climbed back into the fight with superior energy, and shot down 2 of the 4 Zeros. The other 2 disengaged. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that their most effective aircraft, the Zero, was optimized for the wrong kind of combat by late 1944. Think about this for a second. The Japanese had the most maneuverable fighter in the world. Experienced pilots, years of combat experience, and American pilots figured out how to beat them by doing something their own trainers said was impossible. Drop a comment. What does this say about innovation in combat? About following the rules versus doing what works? Because this tactic didn't disappear after World War II. It changed fighter combat forever. The inverted dive tactics developed over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945 didn't disappear when World War II ended. They became embedded in fighter tactics doctrine, though often without attribution to the desperate innovations of P-38 and Corsair pilots fighting for survival. Modern fighter combat training at institutions like the Navy Fighter Weapons School, known as Top Gun, includes negative G maneuvers as standard defensive tactics. The terminology has changed. Contemporary pilots call it a negative G pushover or unloaded roll. But the fundamental physics and purpose remain identical to what Thomas Lynch figured out over New Guinea in April 1943. The Soviet-built jet fighter had excellent high-altitude performance and could outturn most American aircraft in horizontal combat. F-86 Sabre pilots, facing analogous problems to what P-38 pilots encountered against Zeros, used vertical maneuvers and negative G escapes when MiGs achieved advantageous positions. Captain Joseph McConnell, the top American ace of the Korean War with 16 kills, credited his survival in several engagements to what he called rolling out underneath pursuing MiGs, precisely the same inverted dive concept. Now applied to jet combat at 40,000 feet and 600 miles per hour. Vietnam-era fighter pilots rediscovered these lessons the hard way. Early in that conflict, American pilots, trained primarily for beyond-visual range missile combat, found themselves in close-range dogfights against nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The initial engagement results were poor. The establishment of Top Gun in 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar represented institutional acknowledgement that dogfighting skills, including negative G defensive maneuvers, remained critically important despite technological advances. Instructors at Top Gun taught tactics that Pacific War veterans would have recognized immediately. Use your aircraft's strengths, avoid the enemy's advantages, and when defensive, go vertical and inverted if necessary. Modern fighter aircraft are designed with negative G capability built in. The F-16, F/A-18, and F-35 all have fuel systems, engine designs, and structural strength that allow sustained negative G flight without the limitations that plagued World War II aircraft. Pilots train in centrifuges to build tolerance for both positive and negative G forces. The readout effect that terrified pilots in 1943 is now a known and manageable phenomenon. But the underlying principle hasn't changed. Negative G flight allows maneuvers that opponents don't anticipate, creating separation and opportunities for counterattack. What makes the Pacific War innovation remarkable is that it happened entirely outside official channels. No aeronautical engineer designed the tactic. No tactical development board approved it. No training command incorporated it into syllabi, until after pilots had already proven its effectiveness through hundreds of combat engagements. It spread through the Warrior Network, experienced pilots teaching survival skills to new arrivals. Person to person, squadron to squadron. The men who developed these tactics didn't receive recognition beyond their immediate units. Most never knew their improvised solutions would influence fighter combat doctrine for the next 80 years. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, survived the war partly because he mastered vertical combat and wasn't afraid to fly inverted when circumstances demanded. Thomas Lynch, who first employed the tactic intentionally, was killed in action over the Philippines in March 1944. Not because his tactics failed, but because combat flying was statistically lethal regardless of skill. Their legacy isn't in medals or official recognition. It's in the fact that fighter pilots today still train to roll inverted and push -G when defensive. A direct lineage to desperate innovations made in cockpits over the Pacific, where survival required rewriting the rules mid-flight. So that's the story of how fighter pilots learned to fly upside down. August 1943. Richard Bong, alone against 3 Zeros, rolls inverted and dives. His vision goes red. He's temporarily blind, but he survives. What started as a desperate improvisation became a tactic that reshaped air combat. American pilots learned that their bodies could withstand impossible stresses, that their aircraft could handle impossible maneuvers, and that sometimes the only way to survive was to do exactly what the training manual said not to do. The split S, the -G break, rolling inverted and diving toward the threat. It violated every principle taught at flight school. It caused physical damage to pilots who used it. It risked structural failure and engine problems. But it worked. And 80 years later, fighter pilots around the world still train on tactics born from those desperate moments over the Solomon Islands. Now I want to hear from you. Final question. What impresses you most about this story? The pilot's courage to try something impossible? The fact that it worked? That we still use it today? Drop a comment below. I read every one. If this story fascinated you, hit that like button. Share it with anyone interested in aviation history or military tactics. These innovation stories need to be told. Subscribe for more deep dives into World War II aerial combat, tactical innovations, and the pilots who changed warfare. Before I go, let me leave you with something one of these pilots said. I can't verify exactly who, but it was recorded in squadron debriefings. They told us flying upside down would kill us. They said our bodies couldn't handle it. They said our planes would break apart. But you know what actually killed pilots? Following the rules when the enemy wasn't. That's the lesson. Innovation doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it comes from the bottom up, from desperate men in desperate situations who refused to die according to someone else's playbook. The pilots who flew inverted over the Pacific didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for official approval. They saw what worked, they shared it with their brothers, and they survived. And because they did, because they were willing to fly upside down, temporarily blind, blood rushing to their heads, defying every rule they'd been taught, thousands of them made it home. That's courage. That's innovation. That's why we remember them. Thank you for watching. Thank you for learning about these incredible pilots. And remember, sometimes the rule book is wrong. Sometimes survival requires doing the impossible. Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and never be afraid to flip the world upside down when you need to. They flew inverted at 18,000 feet with zeros on their tails, and they won. Never forget that.